I've always been told I was lucky to get the house. My grandma's old place wasn't much, just a modest two-story with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper that still smelled faintly of her perfume. But to me, it was everything. It was the last tie I had to her, and after everything that had happened, I needed a place to heal. I'd just turned 28, a time when I thought life would be a little more predictable, but the last few years had been a whirlwind. I'd recently gone through a breakup with my boyfriend of 3 years. It hadn't been a messy breakup. No grand speeches, no betrayal, just a quiet realization that we'd outgrown each other. That left me feeling like I'd lost both him and the future I'd envisioned with him. So when Grandma passed away, it felt like the universe had handed me one more card to play, one more opportunity to start fresh. The house, though small, had been my refuge as a kid. I spent every summer there, with Grandma in the kitchen, baking her famous cookies, and Grandpa in the garden, telling me stories of how they met. It was a home, a real one, filled with warmth and love, and when Grandma passed away, it didn't take long for her will to be read. It was a simple document, nothing fancy, just a few pages that outlined her wishes. And one of those wishes was that I could have the house. She'd never had much, but she wanted me to have this, to take it and make it my own. It was a gesture I never expected. My uncle, who had always been the business side of the family, never spoke much about the will, but I always suspected he assumed he'd be the one in charge of everything. He'd been the one to manage the finances, the one who'd always been the strong arm in the family, the one with the connections and the will to make sure things went his way. He always treated me like I was still the naive girl who didn't understand the weight of family obligations. The kind of man who never let a good opportunity slip by, and the kind of man who couldn't stand it when someone else got more than him. I hadn't even been living in the house for 2 weeks before he showed up unannounced. His knock on the door was sharp, quick, like he was already irritated, even though he hadn't said a word. He walked in as if he owned the place, his presence filling the small living room in a way that made it feel smaller. He was in his late 50s, tall, with a neatly trimmed beard that looked almost too sharp for his face, his suit always a little too fancy for the occasion. That day, he wore a gray blazer, his shoes polished to a perfect shine. But beneath the surface, he always carried the air of someone who thought he was entitled to more than anyone else in the room. "Looks like you're getting settled," he said, his voice colder than I remembered. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped further into the house, glancing around as if searching for something. Maybe he was wondering where I'd decided to stash the real valuables, the ones Grandma had left behind. "Yeah," I replied, trying not to sound as annoyed as I felt. "Just getting comfortable." Then, without so much as a pause, he laid it on me. "You know, you're exploiting the family property, right?" He didn't even wait for a response before continuing, his eyes narrowing. "This house isn't just a place for you to live for free. You should have been paying rent from the moment you moved in." My heart sank. "What are you talking about?" I couldn't even process the words at first. It felt like a cruel joke. "This is my house now. Grandma left it to me." He scoffed, shaking his head, like I was the one who was crazy. "She left you the house, sure, but you're living here, using it, without any regard for the family. You've been here, 2 weeks? You owe back rent for all that time?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my face flushing, the anger rising, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had that effect on me. "You're out of your mind. This is my house." He leaned in, his voice dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. "Well, if you want to live in it and not pay rent, you're going to need to make a case for that, because I've got a few legal options in mind." I stood there, stunned for a second. What was I supposed to say to that? He was my uncle, but he was also the kind of person who would pull every trick in the book to get what he wanted. I had always been the family's quiet observer, the one who stayed in the background, who didn't cause a scene. But now, standing there, facing him, all I felt was fury bubbling up inside of me. "What makes you think you can just show up and demand rent? Grandma wanted me to have this place, I said, trying to steady my shaking hands. She gave it to me. My uncle's eyes flickered for a moment, just long enough for me to catch it, before he smirked. Sure, sure, but you're exploiting the family house, and I won't let you get away with that. I was still reeling when he left, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I started second-guessing everything. Was the house really mine to keep? Had Grandma made a mistake? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. So I decided to do something I should have done weeks ago. I would find the will. I had to. If this was going to be a fight, I wasn't going to back down without knowing for sure who had the legal right to this place. The next few days after my uncle's visit were a blur of confusion and mounting anxiety. I kept replaying his words in my mind. You're exploiting the family property. Over and over, they echoed, each time piercing deeper, as if I'd done something wrong without even realizing it. What was I supposed to do? My grandma had left me the house, but my uncle was so sure of himself, so convinced that he had the right to control everything. I spent the evening searching through Grandma's things, trying to focus on sorting through her belongings, but nothing seemed to take my mind off the fight that was brewing. There were photos, old letters, and trinkets I remembered from when I was a kid, but none of it was the thing I needed. The will. I remembered the conversation when Grandma had passed away. I hadn't paid much attention when the lawyer had read through her will. It seemed like a formality, nothing important at the time. I'd been grieving. But now I wished I had paid more attention, because it felt like my uncle had something up his sleeve. If only I could find the will, the paper that could settle everything. After work, I started going through every drawer and box in the house, rifling through old folders and stacks of papers that had accumulated over the years. The house was a time capsule: old receipts, unopened birthday cards, and boxes of knickknacks, filling every nook and cranny. I searched for hours, getting lost in the dusty corners of the attic and the forgotten drawers in the living room. It wasn't until I was digging through a metal file cabinet in the back of the closet that I finally found it. Tucked inside a worn envelope marked "Important," I found the will. I'd seen the lawyer's letterhead on the front of the envelope before, but this time it felt like the key to everything. I slid the paper out, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded it. The language was legal, the words dense, but there was no mistaking the one sentence that sent a shock of relief through my chest. The property known as 1234 Pine Street, herein referred to as the house, shall be inherited by my granddaughter, protagonist's name, to be used, sold, or managed at her sole discretion. My heart started to race. It's mine. Grandma had left the house to me. There was no mention of my uncle, no clause about rent or responsibilities, just a simple declaration that it was my property, my home. I read it over and over, letting the words sink in. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something close to hope. This was it. I had proof. But even as the relief washed over me, a dark feeling crept in. My uncle wouldn't just give up. I knew that. He wasn't the type to back down quietly. If he was willing to show up at my doorstep demanding money for rent without any legal right, I couldn't imagine how far he'd go to try to take control of the house. I stared at the will for a long time, as if it might change its mind and suddenly give him a claim. But it didn't. It was clear. The house was mine. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the back of a drawer in my bedroom. The last thing I needed was for my uncle to know I had it already. Not yet. He would probably try to do something, force me out, accuse me of forging it, or worse. The next day, I called him. My hands were still clammy from the tension of it all, but I knew I had to confront him. I couldn't just let him bully me into paying him rent for something I owned. He needed to understand that his game was over. I dialed his number, the sound of it ringing in my ears louder than anything. He picked up after the second ring, his voice as smug as ever. "Well, well, if it isn't the prodigal niece. What do you want now?" "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside of me, "I want you to stop trying to steal from me. You have no right to demand rent for this house. It's mine. There was a pause on the other end. I could practically hear him taking a deep breath, bracing himself for what was coming next. Listen, he said, his tone shifting from dismissive to cold. You don't know what you're getting into. I'm not going to let you take advantage of this family. You're treading dangerous waters. I gripped the phone tighter, leaning against the wall. I've seen the will. It's mine, and I don't care what you think. If you want to try and fight me over this, I'll take legal action. I'm done playing your game. There was a long, quiet silence, the kind that made my heart race in my chest. Then, finally, he spoke. But this time, his voice was laced with a quiet threat. You don't know what you're dealing with, but you will. Trust me. I hung up before he could say anything more. I was shaking, my thoughts in chaos, but one thing was clear. I had the proof, I had the right, and if he thought he could scare me into backing down, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The following days felt like a slow-motion train wreck. My uncle didn't let up. His presence seemed to haunt the house even when he wasn't physically there. Every time I walked past the front door, my stomach would tighten, and I couldn't help but brace myself for his next move. It felt as though he was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I spent more time than I cared to admit researching the legalities of property ownership, trying to arm myself with information I could use if he tried anything. The will was crystal clear, but I knew from experience that people like my uncle didn't back down easily. They would manipulate, lie, and twist anything to their advantage. He had a way of turning the most straightforward situations into complex, ugly battles. I wasn't going to let him do that to me. For a few days, there was nothing. I let my guard down, thinking maybe he had realized he couldn't win this one. I even started to feel a little guilty, wondering if I had overreacted. Maybe I could just let things go, tell him I'd pay him rent, or make some other kind of compromise. But just as quickly as I started thinking that, my phone rang one evening. It was an email, his email. I opened it with a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was a legal notice. My uncle had filed a formal claim against me, demanding payment for back rent and threatening to take me to court if I refused. The email was full of legal jargon, most of which I didn't understand, but the words legal action and court proceedings jumped off the screen. My stomach churned. My heart was pounding. It was all happening, just like I'd feared. I stared at the screen for a few moments, my mind racing. He wasn't just trying to bully me anymore. He was taking this to the next level. This was no longer about the house. It was about control, about power. He wanted to win, to prove that I wasn't worthy of what Grandma had left me. He wanted me to feel small, weak, and helpless. I took a deep breath and closed my laptop. I couldn't let him break me. Not this time. I needed to be smart about this. Calm, methodical. I thought back to the moment when I'd found Grandma's will. That feeling of clarity, of rightness. I'd read it over and over, and it hadn't changed. The house was mine. I had every legal right to live here. But my uncle wasn't going to just accept that. I needed to prepare for the long haul. I started consulting with a lawyer, a friend of mine from work, who specialized in property disputes. Her name was Lily, and she was sharp, direct, and knew how to handle difficult people like my uncle. We met a few days later at a small cafe where I explained everything to her. I showed her the email, and then I handed her the copy of Grandma's will. Lily didn't say much at first, just read over everything carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Your uncle is good at this, she said finally, looking up from the papers. He knows how to manipulate, and he's used to getting his way. But you've got a solid case. The will is clear, and you have the right to live here without paying him anything. I nodded, feeling a little relieved but still on edge. But what if he keeps pushing? What if he takes this to court? I'm not sure I can handle a legal battle, and my family? My voice trailed off. What if they all side with him? Lily leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. That's exactly what he's counting on. He's banking on you backing down because you're intimidated or scared. But this isn't just about the house, it's about setting boundaries, showing him that you won't let him control you anymore. Don't let him turn you into the villain for standing up for yourself. Her words gave me some strength, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that gnawed at me every time I thought about the confrontation ahead. What if it all fell apart? What if I couldn't win? The idea of going up against my uncle in front of a judge, in front of the family, terrified me. But there was no turning back now. I had to fight. I couldn't let him take what was mine. The next few days were a blur of back and forth emails and phone calls. My uncle's tone was getting more hostile with each interaction. He tried to intimidate me by claiming that the house was too big for me, and that I couldn't afford it. He hinted that I wasn't capable of handling the responsibility, that I was just a girl playing house. Every time I read one of his messages, I could feel the weight of his words pushing me down, trying to keep me in my place. But the more he attacked, the more resolved I became. And then, one day, just as I was starting to think maybe he had given up, he showed up at my door again, this time with a legal representative by his side. I could see him standing there, in his expensive suit, smug as ever. The lawyer with him was a woman, dark hair pulled tightly back, sharp glasses perched on her nose. She looked like she was used to getting what she wanted, a professional who was in control of the situation. She had that look of someone who dealt with petty people every day and had no patience for drama. "Protagonist's name," my uncle greeted me with a tight smile. "I think it's time we discuss this in person. I've brought someone who can explain the legal implications of your actions." I stood frozen for a second, my hand gripping the doorknob. "I'm not interested in negotiating," I said, trying to sound confident. "The house is mine. You have no right to take it from me." My uncle's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. Instead, the lawyer stepped forward, flipping open a folder and handing me a stack of papers. "These are the documents we've filed with the court," she said, her voice cold and formal. "We'll be proceeding with this case unless you decide to settle." I glanced at the papers. It was everything documents claiming I was illegally occupying the property and an official request for back rent. I could feel my heart racing, but I didn't let it show. I met her gaze and said, "I've seen enough. I don't need to settle. I have the will, and I will take this to court if I have to." There was a beat of silence, then the lawyer's lip curled into a slight smile. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other in court soon." They turned to leave, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. There was no more hiding, no more second-guessing. I wasn't backing down. The fight had just begun, and I was ready. I was starting to feel the weight of the battle settling into my bones. Each day that passed felt like I was marching closer to a confrontation I couldn't avoid. The court papers had arrived. The letter from my uncle's lawyer was thick with formalities, cold words, and veiled threats. My uncle, it seemed, had brought in his legal team, ready to drag this out. I wasn't prepared for this, not entirely, but I had no choice but to be. The threat of losing the house, of losing everything I'd been building, hung over me like a storm cloud. I remember sitting in my small living room, the morning sun streaming through the windows, the house feeling unusually quiet. The papers were spread out in front of me, the ink on the pages stark against the white. I ran my hands over them again, for what felt like the 100th time, looking for something I might have missed. But there was nothing. I had the will. I had the proof that this house was mine. I just needed to hold on to that certainty. Lily, my lawyer, had been more than supportive. We'd gone over everything several times. The case was strong, Grandma's will was clear, and I had nothing to fear except my own nerves. I'd told my family about what was happening. My mother had been supportive, though she hated confrontation. But my uncle? He'd already poisoned the well. A lot of the family had sided with him, believing he was simply trying to protect the legacy of Grandma's house. It didn't help that my uncle had framed the whole situation as me being some kind of irresponsible child who didn't deserve to live there. But I was determined. I wasn't going to let my uncle win. Not this time. The court date arrived. I remember the nervous energy that buzzed through me as I walked into the courthouse. The tall stone building felt imposing, the cool air inside heavy with a certain solemnity. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floors as I followed Lily through the corridors. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching me. I was out of my element. This was all new to me. I didn't belong here, but I couldn't let that show. I had to play this game just as well as my uncle. Lily glanced over at me as we approached the courtroom. "You ready for this?" I nodded, swallowing hard. I don't have a choice. We walked in, and I was immediately hit with the sharp contrast between the stuffy formality of the room and the deepening tension that settled in my chest. My uncle and his lawyer were already there, sitting in the front row. My uncle looked as smug as ever, his expensive suit almost mocking me, as he sat with a smug grin on his face. He looked at me as if I were nothing, just a little girl playing at being an adult. And I hated him for it. "Good to see you again, protagonist's name," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure this will be a short session." I clenched my jaw and kept my gaze steady, refusing to let him rile me up. The judge walked in and slammed his gavel. We all stood up. The formalities began, but I barely heard them. I was too focused on the task at hand, too focused on the fact that my uncle was trying to take everything from me, everything that I had been working toward. I glanced at Lily, who was sitting beside me, her expression calm and collected. She had everything prepared, every argument, every fact. She had even contacted a few other family members who were willing to testify in my favor. But this still felt like David versus Goliath, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The first part of the hearing was a blur of legal jargon, arguments, and counter-arguments. My uncle's lawyer spoke first, laying out his case. They tried to paint me as someone who had simply taken advantage of the property, someone too naive to understand the financial weight of owning a house. They even tried to make the case that Grandma's will was ambiguous, that it hadn't been properly witnessed or filed. It felt like a punch in the gut each time they tried to twist the truth. But Lily was always one step ahead, her sharp retorts cutting through their lies like a hot knife through butter. Then it was my turn. Lily stood up and nodded to me, her face serious but encouraging. I took a deep breath and stood, my hands trembling slightly as I walked to the witness stand. My uncle's eyes followed me with a smugness I couldn't quite shake. I took my seat and faced the judge, my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The judge looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Please state your name for the record." "Protagonist's full name," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "And I am the rightful owner of the property at 1234 Pine Street." I paused, gathering my thoughts before continuing. "I found my grandmother's will, and it clearly states that the house is mine. I have every legal right to live here, and I'm not trying to take advantage of anyone." My voice didn't waver as I spoke. The words felt powerful coming out of my mouth. I was no longer the frightened niece, no longer the girl who had let her uncle walk all over her. I glanced at my uncle as I continued, my eyes narrowing. My uncle is trying to claim rent from me, rent for a house that was left to me. I've done everything by the book, and I won't let him manipulate me into paying something I don't owe. There was a moment of silence in the room, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. My uncle's lawyer sneered but didn't interrupt. "Thank you, protagonist's name," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've made your case. Now we'll hear from your uncle." I wanted to jump out of my seat when my uncle stood, walking up to the stand with that arrogant air that I had come to hate. He was smooth too smooth. He started talking about the family legacy, about how it was his responsibility to protect the house, and how I had taken advantage of Grandma's generosity. But halfway through his speech, something snapped. Something in the room shifted. Lily raised her hand, interrupting him mid-sentence. "Your Honor, I have a statement to make." The judge looked at her, and Lily stood, her presence commanding attention. "We have documents that prove the validity of the will," she said, her voice firm, And I also have statements from other family members who can attest to the fact that Grandma never intended for my client to pay rent for the house. This case is a manipulation, plain and simple. For the first time, my uncle faltered. The smirk fell from his face as the weight of the evidence against him sunk in. I could see the shift in his demeanor, his confidence slipping, his words stammering as he tried to salvage his position. But it was too late. The judge looked between the two of us before speaking, his voice stern. "I believe we have enough evidence here. The house is rightfully yours, protagonist's name, and I am ruling in your favor. The claims of back rent are dismissed." I didn't hear anything after that for a few moments. It was like the world had gone quiet, the weight lifting off my shoulders. My uncle stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and anger, but it didn't matter anymore. The victory was mine. I'd won. The court ruling was a relief, but I didn't feel like celebrating. It was over, but the aftermath still lingered in the air, like smoke from a fire that had barely been put out. I had won, but at what cost? My uncle's defeat was a small victory compared to what had been lost: the trust, the family bonds that had cracked under the pressure of greed and manipulation. The moment the judge's gavel came down, my uncle's face turned ashen, the arrogance that had always defined him draining away like sand slipping through his fingers. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing, but there was nothing left for him to say. "Get out of my way," he muttered as he walked past me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. His lawyer followed behind him, not a word exchanged between them. It was clear they hadn't expected to lose not like this. But for the first time in years, I wasn't intimidated by his presence. I stood tall, watching them leave, knowing that I had earned this victory, fair and square. Lily walked up to me, her smile warm but professional. "You did great," she said, her voice calm but full of pride. "Thanks," I replied, my voice hoarse. "I couldn't have done it without you." We walked out of the courtroom together, the weight on my chest feeling lighter with each step. The sun outside seemed brighter, and I couldn't help but take a deep breath of fresh air. It was over. The house was mine, and no one could take that from me. But as I walked out into the parking lot, I found myself looking around for my uncle, expecting him to show up at any moment, to do something, to cause a scene. But he didn't. He was gone. It felt almost unreal that I had finally stood up to him, after all these years of being the quiet, passive niece who let him control everything. The fear I had carried for so long was finally gone. The next few days were a blur of messages from family members, all asking what had happened. Most of them sided with my uncle, either out of loyalty or because they didn't understand what had really been going on. But there were a few who reached out to me, people who had seen through my uncle's manipulation and who congratulated me for standing up for what was right. One of the most unexpected calls I received came from my mother. We hadn't talked much about the situation. She had been caught in the middle, torn between supporting her brother and wanting to support me. When she called, her voice was gentle, almost hesitant at first. "I heard about what happened," she said softly. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." I blinked back the tears that suddenly threatened to spill over. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without knowing I had some kind of support." She sighed, a long breath that felt heavy with years of unspoken things. "I should have stood up to him a long time ago, too, but I'm glad you did." Her words hit me harder than I expected. In a way, it felt like she was apologizing, acknowledging the years of passivity that had allowed my uncle to do what he did. It wasn't easy for her either. She had been stuck in the middle of family loyalty and the truth, just like I had been. But in that moment, we both understood each other a little more. I wasn't alone in this, and neither was she. As the days passed, the pressure of my uncle's threats slowly ebbed away. The house became mine in more than just the legal sense. It was mine in every way that mattered. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a place where I could breathe, where I could rebuild myself. I spent a lot of time in the garden, pulling weeds, trimming the hedges. It felt therapeutic, grounding. My grandmother's rose bushes were still there, tangled and wild, but they would bloom again with a little care. Just like me, the house needed some tending, but I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked into that house. The girl who had been afraid to stand up for herself, who had let her uncle walk all over her, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, someone who had fought for what was hers and won. As for my uncle, the rest of the family learned the truth about what he'd tried to do, and slowly, his reputation in the family started to crumble. He'd always been the one to pull the strings, the one with the power and the control. But after the court case, his influence began to slip away. He was no longer the untouchable figure he once was. Word spread, and people started talking. They saw him for what he was, a man driven by greed and entitlement. His manipulation couldn't hold up against the truth. I hadn't expected it, but the consequences for him were swift. He lost his influence over the family, and eventually he stopped showing up at family gatherings altogether. My mother, though still conflicted, began to see him for who he really was. The distance between them grew, and I wasn't sad about it. In fact, I was relieved. I had won more than just the house. I had reclaimed my place in the family, my dignity, and my strength, and now the house, once a symbol of conflict, was a place of peace. It was where I could finally be myself, without fear of anyone trying to take it from me. The victory was mine, and I had earned it.